All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we are going deep, really deep, into the minds of Trump voters.
Ooh, exciting.
You guys requested this deep dive because, well, you're curious. What was going on? What really drove people to the polls back in 2024? We're going way beyond those headlines.
Yeah.
And we're going to be digging into some really fascinating data from the Pew Research Center.
Oh, Pew is great.
They surveyed Trump supporters all throughout the 2024 campaign.
Wow. The entire time.
Yeah, so it gives us a unique glimpse into like their hopes and their fears and expectations heading into that election.
It really is like a time capsule
Totally.
of the 2024 electorate. Yeah. Right. We're not just talking exit polls here. We're seeing how their views actually evolved over time.
That's exactly it. And I gotta say, the first thing that jumped out at me was this overwhelming desire for change.
Hmm.
A full 86% of Trump supporters, they believed he would shake things up in Washington.
That's a lot.
I know, right? But here's the thing. 92% of Harris supporters, they thought those changes would be for the worse.
Oh.
So talk about a polarized electorate.
Really highlights the deep chasm that existed,
Yeah.
back in 2024. For one group, shaking things up, that's a positive, a sign of disrupting the status quo. Right. But then for the other, it's like a threat, sign of instability.
Totally, yeah. Okay, so change was a huge motivator, but we got to talk about the economy. I mean, no surprises here. 93% of Trump voters said it was a key factor in their decision.
Yeah. The economy is always a big one.
Always, but what I found really interesting was how immigration shot up to be like the #2 spot.
Oh, that's right. It was way higher than in the past.
Much higher.
That's a huge jump. Like back in 2020, only 61% of Trump voters said immigration was a top issue, but now it's 82%. That tells me something big shifted in the national conversation.
For sure.
It really pushed immigration to the forefront of their minds.
I wonder if it was a specific event or like a change in how the media was framing the issue. What do you think?
It's hard to say for sure without, digging deeper, but it's definitely worth considering that broader context.
Yeah.
I mean, were there major immigration-related news stories? Were they dominating headlines? Was there, a perception of a crisis at the border? These are the kind of questions we need to ask to really understand this pretty dramatic shift.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we got that desire for change, the economy, and the surge in concern about immigration. But the Pew data also reveals some super fascinating insights into the cultural issues that really resonated with Trump's base.
You're talking about those cultural flashpoints.
Yeah.
The ones we talked about before,
Yeah.
right? The ones that really expose those deep divisions.
Exactly. And there are 4 issues where Trump supporters, they showed just a remarkable level of agreement. So first, 92% firmly believe that biological sex is not mutable.
That's a pretty high number.
It is. Second, a whopping 89% agree that owning a gun makes you safer.
Wow.
Now, these are views that put them directly at odds with the majority of Harris supporters,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
which just shows how deep these divisions run.
It's not even just about disagreeing on policy solutions at that point.
Right.
It's about fundamentally different worldviews, different understandings of what it means to even be American.
Yeah, it's like they're speaking different languages,
Oh, yeah.
even though they're living in the same country.
That's a really powerful way to put it.
Yeah, and the Pew data reveals 2 other cultural issues where this divide is super apparent. So 83% of Trump voters, they believe that the criminal justice system is too lenient on criminals, while 75% don't believe that the legacy of slavery has much of an impact on Black people today.
Wow. Yeah, those are some deeply controversial viewpoints.
For sure.
I mean, these are the viewpoints that really fuel those heated debates and make finding common ground incredibly difficult.
Yeah, those last 2 findings, I mean, they definitely challenge this idea of a united America. But hold on, because there are a couple surprises in the data that don't fit neatly into what we think we know about Trump voters.
Oh, the unexpected twists and turns.
Yeah.
That's where things get really interesting.
So, for example, I was surprised to see that 71% of Trump supporters actually reject the idea that women's gains have come at the expense of men.
Interesting.
So that goes against that stereotype of them being anti-feminist, right?
So it really does suggest a more nuanced understanding of gender dynamics
Yeah.
within that segment of the population. It challenges us to look beyond those, simplistic labels
Right.
and really recognize the diversity of viewpoints even within a group that's often just painted with a broad brush.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's another one that caught my eye. 55% of Trump supporters support separation of church and state. Now, that's still lower than Harris supporters, but it's higher than I would have guessed.
Given some of the rhetoric,
Yeah, given some of the rhetoric around religious freedom during the campaign.
it is a good reminder that voters, even those within the same political camp, they can hold seemingly contradictory views.
For sure.
And it raises all these really important questions about how they reconcile those beliefs. And then also how those beliefs might translate into specific policy preferences.
So we're seeing some unexpected complexities here.
Yeah.
But let's get back to that classic size of government debate. Where do Trump supporters stand on that?
Well, unsurprisingly, they lean heavily towards smaller government.
Oh,
A full 72% of Trump voters believe that government aid to the poor actually does more harm than good. This aligns with this long-standing Republican belief in individual responsibility
right.
and just a skepticism of government intervention, particularly when it comes to those social safety nets.
So less government intervention overall.
Yeah.
But here's a curveball. Both Trump and Harris supporters seem to agree when it comes to Social Security.
Yeah, that's such a crucial point. Strong majorities in both camps, 77% of Trump supporters and 83% of Harris supporters oppose cuts to Social Security.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, I mean, this suggests that even in our deeply polarized political climate, there's still common ground on certain issues,
Yeah.
the ones that directly impact people's lives.
It seems like even with all those deep divisions we've been talking about, there are still some shared values, some areas where people across the political spectrum can find common ground. It's almost, I don't know, reassuring.
It is a glimmer of hope, right?
Yeah.
And it reminds us that reducing entire groups of people to, simple labels
Right.
ignores the inherent complexity of individual beliefs.
For sure. But before we get too optimistic, let's shift gears and talk about the overall mood among Trump voters in the lead up to the election.
Yeah, because something tells me it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows.
Definitely not.
You'd be right. In fact, a sense of pessimism was pervasive among Trump supporters. Just 1 month before the election, only 5% were actually satisfied with the state of the country. Couple that with the fact that nearly 9 out of 10, 89% to be exact, were deeply worried about rising prices.
Wow, only 5% satisfied.
Yeah.
That's a pretty stark contrast
It really is.
to the whole Make America Great Again slogan, isn't it?
It certainly is. It suggests that for many Trump voters, again, part of that slogan, it referred to a time they felt was long gone, a time when things were better, safer, more prosperous.
So it was a vote driven by nostalgia.
That's a fascinating question. And it actually ties into something else that stood out in the Pew data, clarity.
Okay.
Trump supporters overwhelmingly felt they understood his policy positions, particularly on immigration, the economy, and foreign policy. A full 94% believed he'd clearly explained his stance on immigration.
That's a lot of confidence in his message.
Yeah.
But did they expect him to follow through on all those promises?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting, because while Trump supporters clearly embraced his broad vision, their views on specific actions were sometimes a bit more nuanced. And this brings us to some of the more controversial aspects of his campaign.
Oh, you're talking about those hints he dropped about taking certain actions if he won, right? The ones that had some people worried about executive overreach.
Exactly, and the data actually reveals some fascinating contradictions. So, for instance, 58% of Trump supporters said it would be acceptable for him to bypass Congress with executive orders if necessary, while 54% were okay with him ordering investigations into his political rivals.
Interesting.
Now, these findings suggest a willingness to bend the rules, to accept those unconventional tactics,
Right.
even if it meant, challenging democratic norms.
So a willingness to shake things up, even
Right.
if it means breaking a few eggs.
Yeah,
But it wasn't a blank check, right?
absolutely not. The data also shows that 58% of Trump supporters found it unacceptable for him to fire government workers deemed disloyal, and 57% were against pardoning convicted friends or supporters. Now, these findings suggest that even among his most ardent supporters, there were limits, boundaries they didn't want him to cross.
Okay, so they wanted a strong leader, but not an authoritarian one.
Right.
They wanted change, but only within certain parameters.
That's a fascinating paradox, isn't it?
It really is, and it really highlights the challenge Trump faces as he enters his second term. He needs to balance those expectations of his base with the need to actually govern a diverse nation.
Right.
And speaking of governing a diverse nation, there's one final finding that I want to touch on before we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Okay.
And it's the finding that surprised me the most.
All right.
And it has to do with unity.
Oh, the quest for unity.
I know. So, despite all the polarization we've been discussing, a whopping 86% of Trump supporters believe that he should address all Americans' concerns, even if it means disappointing some of his own base.
That's a really high number.
It is, right. And 70% believe the next president should work with the opposing party.
That's remarkable, isn't it?
It is.
It suggests a real yearning for unity, a desire to move beyond all that partisan rancor that we see so much of that
Right.
has come to define American politics.
But is it a realistic desire? I mean, can you truly unite a nation when its citizens hold such fundamentally different values, different visions of what America should be?
That's the million-dollar question.
It really is.
And that's what we're going to be exploring in the next part of our deep dives.
Awesome.
We're going to delve into the potential policy implications of these findings and what this complex mix of expectations means for the future of American politics.
I can't wait. All right, we'll see you guys in the next part. Welcome back to our deep dive into those Trump voters back in 2024.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
We've been really breaking down those Pew Research Center surveys, and it's so clear there's way more to this story than those headlines. You know, they always try to simplify things.
Oh, for sure.
They make it seem so black and white.
Yeah, those surveys really challenge the stereotypes about Trump supporters, They're not just this monolithic block with, like, identical views,
Right.
but a really complex group, diverse opinions,
Yeah.
and even some internal contradictions.
It's true. We've really seen that play out in their views on, I mean, everything
Yeah.
from economic policies to those really hot button cultural issues.
Mhm.
And then there's that surprising yearning for unity
Oh, yeah.
that we were talking about at the end of the last part.
Yeah, that yearning for unity, I think that's a really crucial thread to pull on as we move forward in this.
Sure.
It seems paradoxical, right?
It really does.
You have these deep divisions, these fundamental disagreements on, like, core values.
Right.
Yet at the same time, there's this desire for a leader who can unite the country.
I mean, it makes me wonder if that yearning for unity is more about a longing for stability, and a sense of shared purpose. Maybe it's less about everyone agreeing on every single issue and more about just feeling like we're all pulling in the same direction.
I think that's a really insightful point.
Yeah,
It could be that this desire for unity is really a reaction to how polarized everything's become.
totally.
And the division, I mean, just how that's characterized American politics in recent years.
Yeah.
Perhaps for a lot of Trump supporters, unity represents a return to a time when things felt less chaotic, less fractured.
A time when they felt like their values were more widely shared, more respected.
Exactly. And that actually ties into something else we've observed in the data.
Okay.
This sense of pessimism and anxiety about the direction of the country.
Yeah, remember that stat? Only 5% of Trump voters
Oh, it's so low.
were satisfied with the state of the country just a month before the election.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of that disconnect between how things are and how they want them to be, right?
Right.
And it makes you wonder if for some, this desire for unity is also a desire to turn back the clock to a time they perceive as more stable, more aligned with their values.
So it's not just about uniting the country like in the present, but also about uniting it with an idealized version of the past.
Yeah, that's a possibility worth considering for sure. And it raises some important questions about how we as a nation
Yeah.
can address these complex and often conflicting desires.
Yeah.
Can we find a path forward that acknowledges the concerns of those who feel left behind
Right.
by those societal changes, while also embracing the values of inclusivity and progress?
It's like the $1,000,000 question.
It really is, and it's a question that goes beyond politics and touches on something deeper. You know, something about our collective identity as Americans.
Exactly.
What does it even mean to be American in the 21st century? What values do we even share? How do we navigate our differences?
Right.
I mean, these are questions philosophers have been struggling with for centuries.
I know.
And they're questions that are becoming, I think, increasingly urgent
Yeah.
as we try to navigate the complexities of our modern world. And I really do think the data we've been looking at offers some clues.
Like what?
Well, for example, we've seen that even within a group as seemingly homogenous
Right.
as Trump supporters,
Right.
there's a remarkable diversity of viewpoints.
Totally.
They're not all white working-class men from the Rust Belt,
Right.
as the media often portrays them. They're women, minorities, young people, college graduates. They're a microcosm of American society itself.
Yeah, it's a good point.
And it reminds us we need to be wary of those simplistic narratives,
Mm-hmm.
reducing entire groups of people to like a caricature.
Yeah,
And it makes me wonder if that yearning for unity we've observed
right.
is in part a yearning to be seen,
Yeah.
to have their voices heard, to have them respected, even if their values don't align with those, the so-called elite.
You're saying it's not just about like economic anxiety or cultural grievances,
It's not just that.
but also about belonging, about feeling like they have a stake in the future of the country.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And it's a feeling that many Americans, I think, regardless of their political affiliation, can relate to.
totally.
We all want to feel like we belong, like our voices matter. And in this era of rapid social and economic change, I mean, that sense of belonging can feel elusive.
So what can we do about it? How do we create that sense of belonging when society is becoming, increasingly diverse, increasingly fragmented?
That's the challenge, right?
Yeah.
It's not an easy question to answer, and there's no simple solution.
Right.
But I think it starts with listening,
Okay.
really listening to each other, even when we disagree,
Right.
even when it's uncomfortable.
Listening without judgment.
Yeah,
Listening with the intention of understanding rather than just waiting for our turn to speak.
exactly. It's about creating spaces where people feel safe to express their views,
Right.
even if those views are unpopular or controversial.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that even when we disagree, we can still find common ground.
Hmm.
We can still build relationships based on mutual respect.
It sounds like you're talking about a shift in our political culture.
I think I am.
A move away from the zero-sum game that seems to define so much of how we talk about things these days,
I think you're right. It's about
Yeah.
recognizing that our differences aren't a weakness,
Hmm.
but a strength. It's
Right.
about embracing the richness, the complexity of American society
Yeah.
and finding ways to actually harness that diversity for the common good.
Easier said than done. Right.
Of course, it's a long and challenging journey,
Yeah,
and there will be setbacks,
for sure.
but I believe it's a journey worth taking.
Yeah.
The future of our democracy depends on it.
Okay. So we need to listen.
Mhm.
We need to build bridges.
Yes.
We need to embrace our differences.
Yeah.
But how do we actually translate those like lofty ideals
Right.
into concrete actions?
Yeah.
How do we move from this yearning for unity to actual unity?
Well, I think it starts with small steps,
Mhm.
individual acts of kindness
Mhm.
and understanding. It starts with reaching out to people who are different from us,
Right.
having those difficult conversations,
Mm.
being willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases.
So it's not just about waiting for like our leaders to solve the problem.
No, not at all.
It's about each of us taking responsibility for creating a more unified society.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, that our fates are intertwined.
Right.
And it's about believing that even in the face of these deep divisions, we can still find a way to move forward as a nation,
Yeah.
but we have to be willing to put in the work.
Okay, that's a really powerful message. We need to shift our mindset,
Hmm.
focus on building bridges, and remember that we're all part of the same team here.
Yes.
But let's get back to like the specifics of our deep dive.
Okay.
We've talked about the hopes, the fears, the motivations of Trump voters.
Mm.
But what about the practical implications of all this? How might these expectations actually shape the political landscape in the coming years?
That's a crucial question, and it's one we'll be getting into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore those potential policy implications and what this complex mix of expectations really means for the future of American politics.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the minds of Trump voters. We've been exploring their motivations, those expectations for change, and that surprising yearning for unity. But now we got to get practical. Like, what might actually change in Trump's second term based on what we've uncovered from those Pew Research Center surveys?
Well, one thing that really jumped out at me is how immigration became such a defining issue for Trump voters this time around. Remember that stat? A whopping 94% felt like he'd clearly explained where he stood on immigration.
It was a huge number.
So I think it's pretty safe to say that immigration is going to be front and center in his second term.
Right, and that 82% who said it was like a top issue for them, that's a massive jump from 2020. What kind of concrete actions do you think they'll be expecting to see?
Well, I mean, based on his campaign and what he's done in the past, I think it's pretty likely we'll see him pushing for even stricter border controls, maybe even expanding that wall further.
Right, right.
And he also talked a lot about limiting legal immigration and cracking down on undocumented immigrants. So those are definitely areas to keep an eye on.
Okay, so big changes to immigration are almost inevitable. What about the economy? I mean, we know that was a major concern for a lot of his base.
Oh, absolutely. Remember, 93% of Trump voters told Pew that the economy was crucial to how they voted. So addressing those concerns about rising prices and just, their financial well-being overall, that's going to be paramount for him.
So, what could we see? More tax cuts, deregulation, or do you think he might try something completely different this time around?
My guess is it'll be a combination of those familiar strategies, but maybe with some new approaches mixed in. We might see tax cuts that are targeted specifically at businesses and individuals with the aim of trying to stimulate economic growth. Deregulation is also a pretty safe bet, I think, especially in industries that he views as being, overburdened by those government rules and regulations. And we can't forget about trade either. He's really signaled a willingness to shake things up with some of those existing trade deals. So that's an area where we could see some big surprises.
Okay, so buckle up for some potential turbulence on the economic front. Now let's talk foreign policy. Always a wild card with Trump. What clues do you think we have about his approach this time around?
Well, he's been pretty consistent with that America First rhetoric. So I think we can expect him to continue, to put what he sees as American interests above all else.
Which means,
Well, it could mean taking a much more assertive stance, even towards traditional allies, if he feels like they're not pulling their weight. We might see him sort of going it alone more often on the world stage,
mhm.
relying less on multilateral organizations. And of course, his approach to those major players like China and Russia, I mean, that's going to have huge global implications. It's going to be fascinating, I think, but definitely a bit unpredictable.
Okay, so we've got immigration, the economy, foreign policy, all areas where we could see some pretty big changes. Anything else we should have on our radar?
Don't forget about those cultural issues where we saw Trump supporters were just in such strong agreement.
Right.
I mean, those underlying values and beliefs, those are likely going to influence his approach across a whole range of policy areas.
Right. Things like gender and criminal justice reform, the role of religion in public life.
Exactly. Those deeply held beliefs, I mean, they could end up shaping everything from his judicial appointments to his stance on social programs, even how he approaches education policy. It's a reminder that these culture wars we hear so much about, those aren't just abstract debates. I mean, they have
Oh.
very real policy consequences.
It's true. Okay, so we've got sort of a potential roadmap of those policy shifts based on what we've learned about Trump voters. Immigration, the economy, foreign policy, all influenced by those deeply held cultural beliefs. Anything else our listeners should keep in mind as we head into this new era?
Yeah, it's really important to remember that governing isn't a solo act, right?
Right.
I mean, Trump might have a really clear vision for what he wants to do, but he has to work within that complex system in Washington. Lots of moving parts.
Yeah.
Congress has its own, internal power struggles. The courts can challenge his actions or uphold them. And of course, public opinion can really shift quickly and unexpectedly.
It's true.
All of that can put a lot of pressure on his agenda.
So it's not like he can just snap his fingers and get everything he wants, right? He's going to face pushback, he's going to have to negotiate, make compromises. Sounds like business as usual in Washington.
Exactly. I mean, our system of checks and balances is really designed to prevent any one person or branch of government from having too much power.
Right.
So while we might see some bold moves from Trump, I think it's safe to say there'll be plenty of roadblocks and detours along the way.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the world of Trump voters. We've really explored their motivations, those expectations for change, and how that might all translate into actual policy in his second term. But, this is just a snapshot in time. Things can change so quickly in politics.
That's true. I mean, that's why it's so important to stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. Don't just passively consume the news. You got to question it, analyze it, and form your own conclusions.
And that's what the deep dive is all about, giving you the tools to understand our complex world and really form those thoughtful opinions. Thanks for joining us on this journey. And remember, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those brains buzzing.